All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome. If you are here, you should be joining Efficiency with Empathy, Automating Deceased Constituent Updates in Razor's Edge. Today, we are lucky enough to have Christine Prete, Director of Development of the Diocese of Trenton, walk us through this presentation. My name is hello Sam. I love the chat. I was just going to suggest if anybody has any questions, comments. If you have comments or would just like to participate in chat, please do so using the chat function. If you have any questions, use the Q&A function on the left-hand side. I love all of the memes. Hello, Cookie Monster. I just had cookies. I just had 3 or 4 cookies to get me through the rest of the day, get me through the rest of BB Dev days. I keep on saying Bev days. It's unfortunate. Hello from Baltimore, Maryland. I love it all. And stick around at the end, and I'll pop up a survey for everybody to fill out for this session. So without further ado, I want to hand it over to Christine and get us going.
Thanks so much, Rob. So excited to be here and see a lot of familiar faces in the chat as well. So hello to everyone. Thank you for signing up for this session. I hope the subject line was a bit intriguing for our organization. This is very personal and near and dear. So a little bit about myself. I work for the Diocese of Trenton. It's a religious nonprofit based out of Trenton, New Jersey. I work at the Chancery, which oversees 97 parish and their activities. The whole scope of what we oversee is just all over the place. But me, I'm focusing in the realm of our Office of Development. That is where I am the director. I actually started my career here at the Diocese 12 years ago, working in the IT department. So I do have a small technical background, but a lot in help desk network support. About 2 years after that, I was asked to join the development team as the database administrator. At that point, I only supported Razor's Edge. I never used it for any fundraising purposes. And also, we were starting a $75 million endowment campaign. So it was quite the push into using Blackbaud Razor's Edge. From there, I became the Associate Director of Development Operations, which I absolutely love because the role was basically all about creating efficiencies for the department. And most recently, the past 2 years, I'm now the Director of Development. So you can imagine I have other responsibilities. So what we're going to cover today is just something from going back 10 years when I was the DBA. I've always envisioned. It was just never something that I thought could be possible. And when I started this project, I came on board at the Blackbaud University with Heather and, oh my gosh, I can't remember the other gentleman's name. But anyway, that was during COVID time. So it was a great opportunity to learn Power Automate and so forth. So we're like, okay, this is going to be my project. I started it. And of course, I had a lot of transition. So we also had a consultant that worked with us who I see is on the session, Matt. I want to give him a big shout out because he helped me, build this flow to what it is today. And we're really excited about that. So what I want to just talk about first is our ParishSOFT database. So obviously our diocese, we have our CRM, which is Razor's Edge. But as I mentioned, we have 97 parishes who have their own CRM, which would be ParishSOFT. You may have heard of that software before. What we pull from ParishSOFT would be new registrants, families that unregister, marital changes, and what we're talking about today, of course, deceased records. So from a development perspective, you never want to mail to someone who is deceased, especially if they were buried in one of your parishes. And your parishes know that you have access to that information. So this process that we're going to cover is something that we would do manually. So we'd get a list of all of our deceased deceased parishioners. We would manually look them up in our Razor's Edge database, and then we'd have to perform 5 to 6 different processes. So as you can imagine, it could take a while. Now, before I start screen sharing, ParishSOFT does have an open API. It is something that we started to explore, but haven't moved in that direction yet because what we're doing now is monthly, but we could be doing it nightly and even automate it more. I'm also really excited to learn that ParishSOFT also has a Power Automate connector now available. So it's something I'm going to start exploring over the summer to see if we can now have this process run nightly, have it be automated. But what I'm about to show you, I think it's 100% impressive, and it reduces the amount of administrative time that our staff now works on updating deceased records. So having that direct source of information in the CSV file is what the flow is built off of. I'm just going to share my screen. Let's see. Okay. Rob, I don't know if you can respond. Can you see my screen? Just want to make sure before I continue.
Yeah,
on.
I could totally Power Automate ParishSOFT direct.
Okay.
Yep.
Yes, I'm not a PowerPoint user, but I try to play one during this process.
Yep, you are today.
Thank you. So looking at our main bullets, what's the task? We're pulling our deceased records from ParishSOFT, and we're updating those in our Razor's Edge database. Simple enough. Realistically, we want to do this monthly. If we do this manually, row by row, it would take us about 2 minutes per record. We're averaging about 275 deceased records from 97 parishes each month. The flow has an average match rate of 65%. So there is a little bit of manual work, but I'll talk more about that afterwards. So as with every flow you build, you must build a diagram. And I apologize for my obnoxious colors, but it's just something, I like the colors, so it works with what I'm doing. It's always suggested get it out on paper, because if you try to build a flow from memory, granted, you're going to run into an obstacle where you didn't think of something and then you have to go back and rechange your flow. So take the time, document it out, make it your own, and use that as a reference. Now I'm just going to point out to you a couple items that I'll be referencing a lot. So this is our ParishSOFT query. So I just pop into ParishSOFT, I built a query, refresh it each time. Right now we have about 66,000 deceased records. And what I do each month is I just pull the full entire file and compare it to last month. When we were doing this process originally, we found out that parishes, they weren't updating deceased records in a particular time frame of when the person passed. I know it sounds a little bit strange, but sometimes administratively the parish didn't have the time to enter the record as deceased, so they would do it 3 months later. So the process wasn't working, so we had to tweak it. So now we just pull out all the records, compare it from month to month, and just focus on those new records. You're going to hear me talk a lot about SharePoint. So SharePoint is our repository for where the flow will pick up the file, but then the flow will write back the results of the file as well. I'm going to switch to my live screen in a minute. Let me do that now. Okay, so here's my live SharePoint portal. What we're looking at right now. So this is where we place the files for the flow to read the constituents that we'll be reviewing. And this is the log file. So when matches are found, when they're not found, the flow will write back to this log file if they were matched, their constituent ID, and the other information that was originally submitted on the ParishSOFT sheet. So again, this is the constituent ID, though, that matched to in Razor's Edge. You'll understand this more once you see the process. And then this is what a deceased file looks like. So if you saw the screenshot of the query, again, just a simple table in Excel. I come in, I paste it in, boom, good to go, and I run the flow. And this is our manual, which I'll talk about afterwards, spreadsheet that houses the information that the secondary flow will run off of. So I just wanted to kind of show you too, as I mentioned, I've been dabbling in Power Automate for a couple of years now, and I would say we have a pretty strong presence of different flows that are active within our diocese and for our particular processes. I use the flow every week when I communicate with our parishes, and I have the ability to fine tune the information that I'm emailing to them, very specific to their particular parish. So it's been a learning opportunity. There's definitely a learning curve, but the possibilities are infinite. So I look forward to continuing my knowledge and growth in this particular program. So last time that I gave a presentation on this particular flow, the flow itself, when you expand the sections, was pausing and just causing a delay. So my whole timing was off and it went well, but it could have gone better. So what I did was I recorded the process of me talking through the flow. Robb and I were testing this out a little bit. So I'm going to start it, but if there is feedback, I might just walk through the flow manually, if you want to call it that. So if you can bear with me for 1 second. So my screen is shared. I'm just going to fast forward a second. Does everybody see a flow right now? Or Robb, can you tell me if you see a flow?
I do. And we have a good question from a user on, can you define what a flow is? Or paraphrase the definition?
Sure. So when I think about a flow, it's a workflow. So let me stop sharing for a second. Okay. So workflow, the shorter term is flow, and I believe it may have been called many different things now with Power Automate. But a flow is basically taking a workflow process. So you have to start somewhere and have an end goal. And you think about, okay, well, what are the steps it's going to take to get from the beginning to the end? And that's basically what your flow is building out, is all those steps. Is that a pretty basic understanding or explanation of how I see a flow? Is there a little more detail that one would like? Yeah, Austin, right. Flow equals a workflow within Power Automate.
Yep, that makes sense to me. If anybody needs more elaboration, just drop it in the chat and I'll follow up with Christine.
Yep. So if you think about workflow that's available in NXT WebView, that's a little bit of a different workflow, but it still has that same premise of what a workflow is. Again, you're starting with your starting point, and then you're getting to an end point, and how you're creating those steps to get to that end point. Okay. So let's go back to sharing my screen. I'm going to share the audio. So when Robb and I were doing this, there was a little bit of feedback. So I want to eliminate that first before I continue on. Okay. So just checking, Robb, you say you see the flow. And if you can, just interrupt it at any point that you do hear feedback, because I'll just manually go through the flow. Okay. Like most ones, I heard that. Everybody else hear that?
Yeah, that was kind of kicking around a little bit.
Okay, well, I'm just going to wing it then, and I'm going to go through it. I have all the flows expanded, so I do feel comfortable going through it. Okay, here we go. Let me get my notes in case I stumble. Okay, so you can see my flow now. This is my live environment that you're looking at. So with every flow, there's typically a process for it to start, a trigger, so to speak. So for this particular trigger, I'm going to press a button, literally manually press a button for the flow to kick off. Sometimes your trigger could be if a record gets populated in a file, then that sets off a flow. But this one is I literally click on a button to get it to run. And here you see we have some variables. So what you do is you're taking information and storing it for a later purpose to be used. And we'll talk about how those variables get populated. I didn't want to go too much in depth of an overview of what a variable is and how they are used, but you'll see them used throughout the flow review. Okay, so what's our first action? We're saying, hey, go and get that ParishSOFT deceased file that we placed into SharePoint. As I showed you that before, that's this file right here. So it's literally what this is saying. Go and get that Excel document that's on ShareFile. Okay. So first thing we need to do is we need to find a match. So under this first scope, a scope groups a bunch of items together that needs to work together or run together. We're asking the flow to grab the information from the ParishSOFT deceased spreadsheet, such as first name and last name. And this is where you're going to see those variables being used. I tend to try not to click on things because I don't want it to crash. But so right here, we're just asking it to concatenate the first and last name of the information that was provided on that particular one, the first row, say, for an example, from the ParishSOFT deceased sheet. Because when you're searching in Razor's Edge WebView, you're not searching by first name, you're not searching by last name, you're searching by first and last name or something else. But we're just using first and last name for this example. So here's that ParishSOFT full name that we concatenated in this variable. Okay, and we're saying, okay, search the constituent connector. And what are the results? So if there are no results, to me, that means we did not make a match on the name. So the name is also used as an enhanced search. So, for an example, if you have had the privilege of using database view, when you use enhanced search, it's going to bring back variations of a name that match to what you were searching for. So this runs that same thought process. So again, I put in Josh Tillman. We have no Josh Tillmans in the database. So if Josh Tillman is not found, if no, it's saying, go back to that log file that I showed you. Let me just, this is the log file here. Go back to the log file, put the ParishSOFT member ID in, and add a note that says constituent does not exist in NXT. Done. Okay, so see, now I'm frozen a little bit. So now what happens if, yes, the count does come back greater than 0? Then what we're going to ask the Razor's Edge to do is we're going to say, okay, let's fine tune that name. So you brought back name variations, but let's get specific. Like, I want Josh Tillman. So it's going to go through and say, out of all those records that were returned as a possible match, how many were Josh Tillman specifically? Okay, so it's back. Okay. So now we found that specific match of Josh Tillmans. Okay, well, again, there could be multiple Josh Tillmans, but we're looking one specifically that has one of 3 qualifiers. So we have an or statement here that says, if this Josh Tillman has the same address in Razor's Edge as on the ParishSOFT file, that's a match. Or if Josh Tillman has the same phone number in Razor's Edge on the Parish file, it's a match. And the third is email. For our purposes, we consider a name match in one of those 3 a valid source or a valid match. Okay, so we have our defined match, and it does not match one of those 3 qualifiers. So we have our if no statement. If not, and it's down towards the bottom, it's going to write back to the log file that the constituent could not be found in the Razor's Edge database. Okay, I just want to scroll. Oh, good, there it goes. Okay, so what if we did find a Josh Tillman with one of those 3 qualifiers? Fantastic, we've got a match. So first thing we're going to check, is that Josh Tillman deceased? Okay, well, if he's already marked deceased, because it could be, we found out through another source, it's going to write back to that log file, hey, Josh Tillman is already deceased. I apologize in advance if there are any Josh Tillmans in the room. It's going to write back to the log file the Razor's Edge ID that it found, along with the other ParishSOFT information, but it's also going to put a note that says ParishSOFT deceased. Oh, I'm sorry. It's going to put the note that says constituent has already been marked deceased. Now, Josh Tillman is not marked deceased in our database. What it's doing now is it's going to write back to an array all the information that we want to store for later use. So as you can see here, we have a little bit of our ParishSOFT information and our Razor's Edge constituent ID and other information blended in together. Because again, we've now found the match, so let's grab information. Any questions? Okay. So this is just that if Josh Tillman did not match to one of those 3 qualifiers, it writes back constituent does not exist. So that's our first scope. Fantastic, we made the match. Now what are we going to do? So at this point, what our next step is going to be is we're going to check to see if they have a spouse. So in our database, our rule is that if there is a spouse, they have a full constituent record. This was done to also help with those automations that we will be doing in the future. It just makes it a little bit easier when the constituent has their full record, I found, in terms of updating records. We're also very fortunate that we have a very high record bandwidth. We have about 400,000 records in our database currently, and our ParishSOFT database has about 280,000 family records. Again, a little bit of a different structure, but anyway. So we're going to check to see if Josh Tillman is married. If Josh Tillman is not married, then okay, he's single. All we need to do, so again, if no, we're going to update his constituent record with the deceased check mark, his deceased date, if it's provided on the ParishSOFT deceased file, Excel, and then we're going to log it back to the SharePoint log file that says, oh, found, matched, completed. And it'll put the note that he was already marked. It'll put the note that he has been updated to deceased. Okay. So now we're left with Josh Tillman, who does have an active spouse. So what we have to now look at is see, is the spouse the head of household? Again, when you have two constituent records, one of them needs to be marked the head of household. So if they are not the head of household, the deceased constituent gets the same 3 steps applied. That's over here. Now, if you remember, when it comes to head of household, it's always backwards for me. If it says true, it means false, but that's just a pain point that you have to work through with individual relationships, I think, in Razor's Edge. So you might be saying that, spouse is equal to the head of household, but I'm looking at yes, but it's actually no, because it's referring to the individual head of household. The individual relationship. So again, the surviving spouse is not the head of household. We are going to update the deceased constituent with those same 3 steps: deceased, deceased date, deceased note. And then we're going to update the surviving spouse's addressee salutation, because by default, they're in their plural with their spouse. So we need to update it to singular. And that's what this does here. Okay. So if they are not the head of household, again, the constituent has the same 3 steps applied. The surviving spouse will have their addressee salutation updated to singular. Okay. Next step is we grab the fundraiser. So at this point now, we're in the flow of Josh Tillman, who has an active spouse, where the active spouse was not the head of household. So at this point, Josh's spouse has been updated with her addressee salutation. Josh's record has been marked deceased, and all the processes that go around being marked deceased. Now, in our environment, the primary fundraiser is the parish that the constituent belongs to. That is only stored on the head of household's record. So we need to take that from the deceased Josh's record and move it over to his surviving spouse. So that's what this next flow is doing. It's grabbing the primary parish, it's copying it, and it's creating the fundraiser onto the surviving spouse's record. And the last scope in this particular flow is updating that surviving spouse to the head of household. So we kind of took care of everything before that, but the final step is making sure that they are now the head of household, because obviously Josh, who is deceased, cannot be. So what this step is doing, it's grabbing the constituent relationships of Josh, and it's now making Josh's individual spouse constituent relationship the head of household. So this is the flow. Are there any questions? Again, I didn't want to go too far in detail because it can become a rabbit hole when you start to review all the information. And I do not use the new designer view. I don't know how many people on this call possibly do. We could set that up as a poll. I find the old school view a lot easier to maneuver through.
I've got a couple questions in the chat and also in the Q&A. Generally, a lot of people are saying how amazing and awesome this is, and awesome flow. This is awesome, amazing. So thank you so much for sharing, Christine. Couple quick questions. Instead of a CSV file, can we use a SharePoint list?
Yes, you could do that. Mm-hmm.
Have you tried, this was early on in the presentation, have you tried Blackbaud RENXT Deceased Finder and compared the results to what ParishSOFT provides?
No.
Okay.
We have not used Deceased Finder at an organization in a few years. We have used it in the past. Not saying I support the product or I don't support the product. I could just tell you, and you're going to find that within, I think, any type of data append service where we'll be entering gifts. And we do have a note that says mark deceased Blackbaud Deceased Finder. So we just like to use the direct source we have because we're not a national organization. Being more fine-tuned to just using our ParishSOFT data does work for us. I mean, we do scan obituaries and so forth, and I know there's flows out there that do this and write the information back to the database, kind of like a deceased search as well. But again, we primarily use our ParishSOFT data just because we are restricted to 4 counties, but I know people move and they pass away and so forth. I don't.
Cool. Yep. Cool. And then does it update the relationship status between spouse and deceased spouse? I'm assuming that's with the workflow that you were working on just right now.
Correct. In terms of it updates, when you think about the relationship, I mean, my primary response is yes, it does update it. So you have your head of household and you have your spouse relationship. And what we did was we made the spouse the new head of household because we're not going to drop that relationship, which would then, automatically make them the head of household. So we're transferring the head of household for that particular spousal relationship during the flow process.
All right. And one more question from Catherine Sumner, one of my customers. How are you doing? Can you use Power Automate in a similar way, but the trigger is that the deceased date has been added to a record in RENXT, and then the flow updates different areas of the record in RENXT? Does that make sense?
It does make sense. So, which I was going to say this to the end. So it sounds like what you're saying is, okay, you found out someone's deceased, so now you're just going to update their deceased date, and then you want the flow to kind of kick off after that. I don't know if it can read, a back end table within NXT. I'm sure it could, and there's people who are more qualified on here to answer that question. I don't see why it couldn't, because your back end table for the constituent connector can pull that information. So I'm going to take a leap and say yes. I see Catherine answered yes or no.
I think yes, that we nailed the question. But then the second part of her question is how fast would those updates appear on the record in her scenario? And that part is, it depends on part 1, right, of the question.
Correct. So I have a slide to show as well. Let me go back to I'm going to show you like a real instance of how fast it runs towards the end of the presentation. Oh, Matthew Thacker. Yes, you need a webhook to listen for the event to trigger the flow. Matt is a great resource. So if he says yes, yep, I believe him. Okay, so let me go back to my PowerPoint. If you're seeing that right now. So for an example, I ran this process yesterday. There was 237 records that were new to be deceased from ParishSOFT since I ran this last time. When I ran it through the flow, it found 127 out of the 237. So it automated 127 instances of the automation, which took 42 minutes. Manually processing, because I said it generally takes about 2 minutes from start to finish, would have taken about 4 hours. So what about the remaining records? So we had 110 records that we had to manually look up. And when we manually look them up, we've got to do it in database view because web view would take way too long. I don't know what I'll do once, or I don't really run this anymore, but I do enjoy it. What we'll do once database view goes, because when you search for a name in database view, it literally takes 30 seconds to see whether or not they are in your database. So it took about an hour. And during that manual review, we found 27 records that the automation did not pick up. And it's primarily because either a phone number did not match or an address was older, and we didn't get that updated through our NCOA change. So there are instances where the flow did not pick up the match, and we're constantly trying to fine tune that. But to update those 27 records, I think I showed you this. So I have a secondary flow that all I do is I paste in the constituent ID that was found, and then the deceased date, if that's on the Excel file from ParishSOFT. And so when that was ran, it took 2 minutes to update 27 records with this particular process. Manually, that would have taken about an hour. So roughly we saved about an hour. So from the time of reviewing 237 records from ParishSOFT into our Razor's Edge database, automation-wise, and with a little manual review, it took about an hour and 44 minutes versus 6 hours. So to me, that's huge. Especially this first part of these 42 minutes, once you run the flow, you kind of step away and you can do other work while you're waiting for it to run. On the left-hand side, it takes about 8 minutes to pull the file from ParishSOFT and put it into the flow. So again, minutes, not hours, or even, long half hour to 45 minutes to do anything. 8 minutes. That's, to me, that's fantastic. And one thing I wanted to show as well, this is Mr. Walter Tester. So you saw how we take a CSV file, we run the flow process off of that. We now have found constituent IDs. We run the flow process off of that. But now you get a piece of return mail. Oh, someone's deceased. Well, previously, we would just manually go through the process of making all those updates. So now I know Mr. Walter Tester is deceased. Here's his spouse, Christine. Walter is the head of household. He has his assigned fundraiser, the Diocese of Trenton. Okay, Mr. Walter is no longer with us. So now we have a deceased update button. So we're I just click that now. It's running in the background, and you'll see on the right-hand side a pop-up window once it's successfully completed. It generally takes about 15 to 20 seconds. I'm expecting to see that at any moment now. There we go. So you can see in the bottom right-hand side, constituent updated. So I'm just going to refresh Walter's record. So Walter is now deceased. His spouse, Christine Tester, is now the head of household. He still has his assigned fundraiser, his notes. So again, we keep a note type anytime we decease a record or inactivate a record, because there needs to be some validation on why that record was made non-usable. So the deceased note type is deceased, and then the description is via Power Automate manual NXT button. If I just go to Christine's record, obviously you'll see I'm the head of household now. I have my fundraiser as the Diocese of Trenton. I copied that over from the flow. And there was one more. Oh yes, my addressee salutation was now updated to be singular. So we have 3 ways to run the deceased process. And again, I think we've come a long way using something similar to this particular process. Again, a CSV file, an Excel file, a SharePoint list. You could build a flow to basically run the steps that are needed. So again, when someone originally asked, well, what is the flow? There you go. The flow is just completing, knowing someone's deceased and getting their record to adhere to our organization's standards for when someone is deceased. Oops. Nope. There we go. So now I'm ready for some Q&A. That's all to my presentation. Again, this was when you have a vision in your head, especially when it comes to a database process, knowing that most likely it could be built out in a flow process is just, it's an awesome vision to have and watch it come to life. I mean, I hope that you found this somewhat impressive because, again, if you've had to live the process as a database administrator updating records, this just simplifies everything.
Yep, seeing lots of good comments again, Christine, and the chat. Austin mentioned that that's like saving 50 hours of a year. Right. So good stuff. Catherine, thank you for bringing that one up. And then I did see a question in here. I'm trying to weave my way through. Oh, do you update marital status?
It's so funny you mentioned that, because I was going through the process, and that is not something that gets updated. But, in WebView, there is a setting that when someone's marked deceased, the system is automatically supposed to update the surviving spouse's status to widowed, but it does not. So I was looking at that today. So that is something that we will build into the flow. A complete oversight. I had to go back and check and see if it was on my diagram. But yes, that is not included in there, but can be easily added in.
Awesome. Good question. The power of the hive mind, for sure. And then kind of a logistics. Is this going to be published in the community?
Yes. So our CSM has been asking, when are we going to put this in the community? So I think we're ready to do that now. And again, the process will need to be obviously tweaked to your own organization somehow. But yes, it will be published to the community. I'll coordinate with my inner people and see about getting that. I mean, I know it's as easy as exporting out and uploading. I just don't know how I could share the flow with anybody like instantly who would like it, but I don't know the specific way to get it up into the community. So I'll reach out to, again, the powers that be in regards to getting a presence in the template showcase.
Awesome. And I have a feeling that there's going to be a lot of information like this that have been shared in the different sessions, shared in the community, because there's a lot of participants asking for, how do I get this? How do I get this? So yes, keep an eye on the community pages, and I'm sure BB Dev Days organizers will figure out a way to communicate that out to everybody.
No, thank you, Dan. I think Dan just posted a link too on how to do that. Thank you.
I see one more question. It looks like married people have separate constituent records. Is this correct?
Correct. Yep, that's our structure for our particular database. The head of household and the spouse each have their own constituent record. As I mentioned, we have a high bandwidth capacity at this time, so going over is not a concern. We're actually trying to, start to whittle down our database in terms for our development purposes. We've been this first year that we've actually used for all of our non-donors. When we did our solicitation, we used our ParishSOFT data. So the next step in what we're really trying to do is get the two systems to talk on a regular basis. Right now, I'd say about 60% of our Razor's Edge records are tagged with the ParishSOFT ID. So there's a family ID and a member ID. The goal is to get the majority of them tagged so we can start talking through the IDs, because we're having more success using the non-donor base out of our parishes ParishSOFT database. But when you come from working in development, I think especially when it comes to data, you trust what's in your own environment, but sometimes it is start to go stale. And when you have access to a system such as a feeder system, as we call it with our ParishSOFT database, we have to now say, okay, well, just give us our donors out of our Razor's Edge database and give us all our non-donors out of our ParishSOFT database. And that's how we work our solicitations for this year. And it's been successful.
Super. Mm-hmm. All right. And I'm going to give questions going once, going twice. I could tell, Christine, by all of the memes, we have Simon Cowell, we have all the people doing very impressive. So well done. Thank you, everybody, for joining. I'm going to put on our survey now, or launch the survey, I should say. So please just take a moment and fill out the survey. Hopefully it's an appreciative survey for Christine and this session. And yeah, look out for information in the community, and probably follow-up emails from the Dev Days organizers. So thank you, everybody, for joining.
Yes, thank you, everyone. Hope you all had a great conference. Y'all, like I'm from the South, I'm from Jersey, but hope you all had a great conference.
That's great. All right. Awesome stuff. Yes, indeed.
All right. I guess I'm still on. Again, thank you everyone for joining us. Stacy, Marilyn, Austin, Matt. See a lot of familiar names. Okay, I guess I'm going to stop from my end. You can tell I'm a newbie. I'm going to leave the stage. Everyone have a wonderful night.